River Driver by L. Ron Hubbard. It was said that when Old Man Plunkett whispered, bulls leaped skyward 5 miles away. He wasn't whispering right now.
Christy, you come right in here quick.
This was not the greeting Christopher Plunkett had expected. But this was probably because his father, not his mother, had first spotted him coming up the steps of the big Seattle home. Christopher stopped in his tracks, looked up at the window of his father's study, and said in a small voice,
"Did you call for me, sir?"
Old Man Plunkett's bombastic reply made the windows rattle as far away as Fifth and Pine.
You gone deaf? Come in here.
Christopher went, with great reluctance. When he got inside the house, his mother, a soft-spoken, doting, rather heavy woman, met him, embraced him, when Old Man Plunkett roared,
Christopher, I think I've got all day and a half and half the night.
Shedding his mother and letting the butler take his bag, Christopher stepped through the big black doors and into his father's presence.
Close behind you,
said Old Man Plunkett, walking up and down the carpet and patting fist into palm behind his back in a very agitated manner. Christopher stood until a blasting
sit down
sent him reeling into a chair. Trying to look bright and attentive, he sat on the edge and gazed at his father.
Look,
said Old Man Plunkett, pointing. Christopher looked behind him and then realized that his father was pointing at no other man than Christopher. Looking down at his white flannels and his coat, copied correctly from a large man's magazine, Christopher could find nothing wrong with himself.
Look, you come back here in ice cream pants, a pink shirt, and an orange tie. You've been gone 4 years, and all you've learned is how to grease your hair. Didn't they teach you anything else in that Eastern knowledge box? A fine physical specimen you are.
Amazed, Christopher raised his handsome face and said,
"I was the fencing champion, and I think I made varsity basketball team. I think I'm in pretty good shape."
Bah!
cried Old Man Plunkett, and then, having no other word on tap at the moment,
Bah!
said again,
When I was your age, I'd been swamper for 6 years. What do you think of that?
Very good.
Bah! Didn't I see you coming up those steps with a banjo?
Why, yes, I played in the glee club.
Played in a glee club? Young man, I thought you went east to learn economics and business administration, not how to wear pink shirts and ice cream pants. I expect you to come back here and take over some of this business. You think I can run 50 mills all by myself, do you? Well, I'll have to for all the help you'll be giving me. I'm through with you.
Christopher's brow grew shiny with small beads of icy sweat. His polished hair seemed to wilt and then rise a little under the baleful glare delivered at it by Old Man Plunkett. 30 years in the lumber business had taught Old Man Plunkett nearly everything there was to know about men. He saw his son for what he was, a carefully groomed, flabby-muscled, knowledge-crammed young gentleman used to getting regular money from home and an occasional extra check from his mother. At 22, at which age Christopher had now arrived, Old Man Plunkett's shoulders had grown large from heavy work, arms like tree trunks, hands like mauls. Christopher's hands were slim and white as a girl's, though perhaps slightly calloused from playing his banjo. Old Man Plunkett's restless roving brought him close to Christopher. An ominous calm settled over the room.
Christopher, I'm through with you. One swipe was enough. No more money, nothing. You are no longer my son, understand?
You mean I'll have to work?
Plunkett's weathered eyes narrowed, and white lightning played under the half-closed lids. He bared his teeth.
But I will give you one chance to show me what you are a man. One chance. I'll give you the chance to earn $1 million in less than a year.
Christopher began to breathe again. Some of his confidence came back. He knew his father to be a bombastic, erratic man, but he knew also that Old Man Plunkett had a big heart under his vest.
That's the amount. $1 million in less than a year. I suppose you'll do anything for that much money, Christopher.
All unsuspecting, Christopher nodded brightly.
I'd almost kill a guy for that much money.
He said in a jocular way. Old Man Plunkett stood back and rocked on his heels.
That's the job.
Christopher smiled, reached for a cigarette, but before he had one fairly in his grasp, he jumped and dropped it.
You mean I've got to kill a man?
That's right.
But listen.
That's the bargain. You will kill a man and you'll get $1 million. I'll give you all the details.
I'll think it over.
You decide right now, young fellow. That man's name is Johnny Newcome, and the last I heard of him, he was going to a big Bowe logging camp. He's taken money from me under false pretenses. He's worthless, a sneak, a sniveling idiot, but he has to be killed before he does me further damage. You get the $1 million the day he is dead. Is that clear?
Yes.
And you look him up and kill him.
Yes.
Jorgensen, no need to unpack Christopher's bag. He's leaving tonight.
But George, cried Mrs. Plunkett, the poor boy.
I've heard enough. No more but George is here. Come on, Christopher. Up with your bag and on your way. My car is waiting outside.
It was raining. The skid road was running a small river, and the trees were drooling silver water. The sky was low, the day was cold, and Christopher Plunkett was heavily laden. His expensive shoes did not keep out much water, nor did they have much traction on the slick timbers. The hat, which had been so fashionable on Fifth Avenue, New York, was now a blob of soggy nothing upon his disarrayed locks. The pink shirt had dyed the pants pink a short way below the belt. The orange tie was back under his ear. His well-cut jacket was ripped by bushes, and the style utterly failed to keep out the chill. From time to time his banjo hummed in discord in its case as he banged it. From time to time Christopher let out a sigh as mournful as the rain. This was the low ebb in his life. He could sink no lower than this. That was humanly impossible. Never having missed a meal in his life, his stomach rebelled against the lack of breakfast. The driver had stopped for nothing, had merely deposited Christopher at the bottom of this skid road, and had shot away through the drizzle, leaving his charge alone in these wet woods. Christopher was quite certain that there would be bears and other ferocious beasts in this wilderness. As a boy, he had been with his mother most of the time, and his mother had been in the East. Knowing nothing of the Northwest, he was ready for anything to happen, and yet not ready at all. Accordingly, when a bush weaved ahead of him and when a brown object emerged, Christopher was certain that his end was at hand. But the object stood there staring at him, and Christopher stood there in the wet staring back. Far off, a strange, long-drawn cry of
"Timber!"
broke the sullen whisper of rain. A mighty crash followed, shaking the forest. Christopher then realized that this thing he was staring at was a man, dressed in a corduroy jacket and a pair of mutilated pants, which showed the full length of his boots. He knew then that he had arrived at the camp or somewhere near it. All morning he had been planning his method of procedure, and he knew it would not do at all for him to blurt out his business. He had hit upon the clever name of Christopher Smith to disguise his own and his business. Besides, he had no wish to tip his hand about why he was there.
Are you the man in charge?
Nah, I'm the cruiser.
Said the Colossus, stroking his unshaven chin with a gnarled hand and looking Christopher over.
You knew Croman, they was to get down to the slave market?
Beg your pardon?
I said, you knew Crummy.
Christopher looked down at his clothes and realized that he did look a little seedy at that.
Come along. I'll hand you over to the kingpin.
Utterly unenlightened by any of this, Christopher tagged after the timber cruiser. The tall one took out a round tin and casually offered some of the dubious-looking contents to Christopher. Wishing to please from the start, Christopher took some irresolutely and then saw that the cruiser had stuffed a quantity into his lip. Following suit, Christopher was startled. He expected flame to shoot far from his mouth. He spat quickly, coughed, turned red in the face, and carefully tested his gums, certain that they were completely burned away.
Snooz'll hit you that way when you ain't get used to it.
They came in sight of a clearing wherein stood several oblong huts built of shakes and logs, all very dismal in the rain. Over it all hung the clean smell of wet sawdust and fur. The cruiser kicked in a door, and Christopher followed him into the dim interior. The place was an office of sorts, desks hewn from rough timber, packing boxes taking the place of chairs. Christopher had thought the cruiser large. He knew now that he was mistaken. The tallest, broadest brute he had ever seen in his life stood up and stared at him. The man must have weighed 250 pounds, and all that bone and muscle. His head was bigger than an average man's, but it looked small. The jaw hung to one side from an old break. The whiskery skin was pocked with marks from some ancient fight. The man smelled sweaty.
Found this on the Skid Row. New Crummy up from the slave market. I don't think the shirt has anything to do with his politics.
New Crummy? You say he's the new Crummy, Slim? Now that's a shame. He's awful pretty, ain't he?
Oh, I wouldn't say that, Penny. Don't matter much about how they look in a week or so. Remember how they used to work on the last Swamp Angel, trying to save him after the first night?
But you can't do anything about a broken neck. Come on, I'll show you your bullpen. Maybe if you break a hamstring keeping it up, Grandpa will let you give the bull a hand.
Worried about his shirt, though. Looks like he's a scissor bill.
Boys will take that out of him, if he is,
said Tiny, leading the way across the clearing. He ducked and entered the door of a bunkhouse. Christopher, far at sea about all this, unable so far to get a word in about his business, followed closely. The tiers of bunks were all in terrible disarray. There had been no Crummy here for the past 3 days, and the blankets and effects had been thrown sky, west, and crooked.
Get it cleaned up. You're the Crummy here.
Suddenly getting the point and realizing that he had been misjudged, Christopher said,
No, I'm here to...
Tiny turned a little, made a cannonball out of his fist, and fired on Christopher's jaw. With a yelp, Christopher was lifted off his feet and thrown bodily halfway across the shack. The banjo punged mournfully as it landed in a far corner. Christopher suddenly got mad. He leaped up, doubled his fists, leaped across the floor, and hit Tiny a resounding blow in the chest. Tiny laughed, and the bunkhouse rattled from the shock of both the laugh and the following thud. Christopher lay back in the bunk where he had landed and gazed dimly at Tiny through a swelling eye. Christopher felt awful. He knew that his spine was broken and that his jaw hung in splinters. He lay very quietly. A mighty fist seized him, jerked him forth, and slammed him down to the floor. Tiny pointed at a pail and a broom.
Chase them. Get me? Clean this place out and clean it fast. One more yowl out of you and I'll show you what happens to a man who calls me a liar.
Christopher was about to protest that he hadn't said anything of the sort when he thought better of it. He crawled toward the bucket and the crude broom. But even then his humiliation was not complete. Tiny's number 13 boot landed in a very personal way. Christopher swallowed his yelp and seized hold of the bucket. When he looked up from his work again, Tiny was gone. For 2 weeks, Christopher's head was in a whirl. Life had become a mad, loud scramble. Boots, fists, sweaty clothes, crashing trees, yowling buzzsaws, clattering timber, shouting loggers, and through it all, like a red thread, ran the agony of his aching body. He had thought at one time or another that he had been weary. He knew now that that was wrong. He had thought long ago that the finish of a hard fencing match was the apex of exhaustion. He knew that that, too, was wrong. In the morning, the yell,
"Roll up, you rosin bellies!"
found Christopher already at work in the cook shack. By the time Dawn got there, he had washed stacks of dishes higher than the tallest timber, had shoveled out trainloads of strawberries, had carted tons of sow's bosom for lunch. By 10, he had peeled thousands of pounds of spuds, making great white mountains of them all about him. By 1, he had washed more dishes than a skidder could drag out of camp in 10 hauls. By 3, he had scrubbed down his bullpen and had put the place to rights, functioning as a crummy. By 8 that night, he had 10 times more dishes than before to wash, and when he had wearily done them, so tired he was rocking on his feet, he still had to get the breakfast together, under the imperious direction of the belly robber, otherwise known as the gut wrecker. This particular bull became, next to Tiny, Christopher's greatest dread. Stalking about the shacks with a naked butcher knife clutched in his greasy paw, the cook would gnaw upon a frayed cigar and mouth terrible things concerning what he would do to his latest helper if this or that did not get finished. Dressed in a collarless shirt, which had seen better days, girded with a flour sack so black you could not read the writing, pure as driven snow upon it, the bull would give his tattered derby hat a defiant twitch and would roar,
All the jack! What the ding-dong you think you're paying for, you ornery son of a hardtail? There's the sun, and you ain't done an hour's work. Log, you scissor-bill, log!
This roar would usually bring Tiny upon the scene if Tiny happened to be about camp. Tiny would loom over the cook and look blacker than the belly robber's flour sack and bellow,
"Can't you handle your own man? How the old Harry do you expect to hand it out if you can't make him work?"
Then Tiny would give Christopher a solid kick with a gigantic boot and walk off. And before Christopher could scramble out of the dirty sawdust, the gut wrecker would descend upon him and follow through and send him down a second time. But that was not the worst. At night, when the rosin-bellies came home, they would slosh cold water over their faces, eat, rest a half hour, and would then find plenty of energy left after a 12-hour stretch in the timber. Christopher was amazed by this show of vitality because it affected him directly. Somehow they had located his banjo and had surmised that he could play it. That seemed the first time very good for Christopher. But when night after night they made him sit against the wall and strum and sing until his fingers were raw, his throat was sore, and his jaws ached, he began to lament his ability. And each time that happened, he would have to finish the evening by doing his own work after everyone else was in bed. Tiny saw to that. So did the bull. So did the bullpen boys. At the end of 2 weeks, Christopher was thinking wildly about going over the hump at the first opportunity. He had not made any inquiry whatever about the man he was supposed to kill. He had been too busy for that. He had tried to explain time after time that he was not there to work and had only a sore anatomy to show for his attempts. He was skinning spuds when he came to the decision. He laid down his knife and stood up. But before he took a step, he heard voices outside. Through the window, he saw Tiny and the belly robber. A fragment of their talk came clearly to him.
"Couple more days, and he'll take the hump. No guts."
Can't do anything with a tie peeler like that. He'll be squawking for his walker tomorrow or the next day. Same leaving me without no crummy.
Can't take it,
said Tiny as they moved away. Christopher knew that they were talking about him. The fact that they would say anything about him outside his own presence was a boost in itself. And they thought he was going to quit and take his pay, did they? They thought he was a quitter, did they? Well, he'd show them. Angrily, he sat down and began to manicure Spuds with renewed vigor. Maybe he'd locate his father's enemy after all. Maybe he'd get a chance at John Newcome and get a crack at that $1,000,000. Then he'd show them. About his feet, the curling skins began to mount rapidly. He hardly realized when he had finished it was done so soon. Another week dragged past, and then, one morning, Tiny yanked him out of the cook shack. Beside Tiny stood a little shriveled man who had shaky hands and a whipped look. This was a new crummy, Christopher guessed from the way Tiny handled him. Maybe, thought Christopher, this was the fellow his dad wanted killed. But he had no time for speculation. Tiny thrust the new man into the shack, snatched Christopher's arm, and dragged him toward the woods. They walked around fallen forest giants, ran a couple timbers, and came upon a man almost as big as Tiny. This fellow was leaning on a crosscut, looking toward camp. He had a matted yellow beard, very brown around the hidden lips. He wore a red hunting hat, which was also stained. His hands were dyed black with rosin. His pants were discolored with grease. He said nothing. Tiny said nothing. Christopher said nothing. Christopher was plunked down across a timber from the stained person. The handles of a crosscut were extended to him. The other man started to work, and Tiny went away. Back and forth went the big teeth across the bark. Christopher pushed and pulled, pushed and pulled. The saw buckled, seized, wouldn't budge. The other man lifted it out, replaced it, spat, and looked at Christopher.
Get the saddle.
Said this stained gentleman.
Beg your pardon?
Just push, don't pull, don't ride it.
They went at it again, back and forth, and the shiny saw gashed deeper into the timber. Then it buckled with a twang and wouldn't move.
Don't drag your feet.
Beg pardon?
The logger carefully stepped upon the log, stepped down, drew back his right, and let go. Christopher lit and bounced. He came up in a charge, ran into a blow hard enough to fall a mule, went down again. The stained gentleman got up on the timber, stepped down, and took up his end of the saw again. Christopher wiped the blood from his mouth, took his station.
Just pull. Just pull when I finish my pull.
Christopher used pulled after that. It was better than peeling spuds and cleaning dishes. For the first hour, that is. After that, his hands became blistered, his back began to ache, and his sight grew dim with weariness. Weariness such as he had experienced before would have been a blessing.
Just pull.
Just pull.
Back and forth, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Monday. The 1st came and went. The 30th came along some 400 years later. Finally, it was the 15th, and it was raining. Tiny came wallowing through the brush to the place where Christopher was working.
Damn this sizzle sozzle. Come up here, Ham, and take this thing.
Another logger came out of the brush and shoved Christopher away from the end of the saw. Tiny gave Christopher a shove toward camp.
Got a job for you. Can you swim?
Yes.
That's better than Larson could. He drowned this morning.
Christopher gulped and followed. Then he started to think better of it. At least, he thought with a glance at his raw hands, it was better than his last job, whatever it might happen to be. They went through camp and down a skid road. Soon they came in sight of the river. Unlike most northwest streams, this river was close enough to the sound to be fairly quiet. In its upper reaches, it was far too turbulent for any logging use, but down here it was smooth. Many timbers were being shot down to it, and down it to the sound, where they were boomed together and sent to a larger sawmill. Christopher stopped at the edge of the wide stream and stared at the river drivers. Somehow, several logs had caught bottom. Other logs had hit them, and the result was a jam so hard that the men upon it looked like ants running up and down a redwood trunk. A pike was thrust into Christopher's hands, and Tiny pointed toward the jam.
Get out there, Banjo. If you drowned, that's tough. But by Henry, you better not drown.
So saying, he showed Christopher his mighty fist and pointed again at the river.
But how?
Tiny gave him a shove and a kick in the pants. Carried by momentum, Christopher went scurrying out along a wide timber. It rolled under him. He tried to roll it back. He missed his footing. The log began to spin. Christopher sent spray geysering heavenward. The icy water whipped the breath out of his lungs. He went down, down, down through the green depths and tried to struggle up. The heavy calked boots he had acquired were holding him under. Suddenly a pike snagged his collar, and a riverman yanked him over a floating log. Gasping for air, chilled through, Christopher tried to mutter his thanks. But Tiny was there by that time. Tiny grabbed his shirt and yanked him ashore. Tiny shook him, hit him on the jaw, and knocked him flat on the oozy bank.
Ain't you got anything to do except worry me? Get up and get out there and stop this monkey shines.
Christopher sat where he was for a moment. He was too dizzy to do anything else. Then the gigantic Tiny took form, and Christopher's handsome face turned from gray-white to angry red. His dark eyes threw sparks, but he got up and walked the log, stepped off into the jam, and inserted his pike between two lodged timbers. The riverman who had pulled him out bellowed,
Not that way, you tie peeler. Get up here and get between these, you scissor bill. And don't get into any more trouble, or so help me, I'll drown you.
Christopher skittered over the logs, jumping from place to place clumsily, and went to work under the direction of the kingpin. In spite of the threats, he went in 3 more times on the first day, and when night finished, he was the most miserably cold man in camp. His back ached with the exertion of tossing jammed logs apart by main strength and awkwardness. His hands, though seasoned for weeks by the crosscut, had blistered on the wet pike. In the dark silence of his bunk that night, he plotted dark things. He had come here to kill a man. He would do that and get out. He'd collect that $1 million and go to New York and live like a gentleman. To hell with this logging. He was washed up. And the next morning, he was back on the river, wrestling with the jam, sweating, shouting with the rest. For 4 long months, Christopher, otherwise known as Banjo, was a river driver. During that time, he had managed to build himself until he was no longer aching at night. Had there been any large mirrors in camp, he would have realized the change which had taken place in him. Instead of a pale, white-fingered young gentleman, he would have seen a square-shouldered, big-muscled roughneck. His hands were the color of pine knots and every bit as hard. He drew his pay only because he needed it for his session at Sunday school. Sometimes this educational institution, he would run into a good hand and a good pot and might come away with some extra change, but not often. Twice he had pressed bricks in the nearby town, but other than that, he had not left the camp. One evening, he was walking back to the bullpen. When he was walking back to the bullpen, he asked the stained gentleman about this fellow, John Newcome. He had hoped up to that time that he would get wind of the man without asking, but he had had no success at all. He hadn't even heard the name mentioned.
Is there a fellow here by the name of John Newcome, Ollie?
Ole spat reflectively, looked hard at Christopher, and then said,
Yeah, there's a fellow by that name.
Which one is he?
I'll point him out sometime.
Is he a very big man?
Ole shook his head very solemnly.
Not so big.
Is he very dangerous?
I tell you, Banjo, he's purely dangerous, all right.
Did he ever kill anybody?
Oh, yeah, plenty of fellers.
So that was why he had his orders, was it?
You know him by sight?
Oh, yeah. I always know him by sight.
You point him out to me someday.
Sure. Someday.
That closed the subject for the moment, but it left Christopher very uneasy. During the whole 6 months he had been here, he had looked cautiously about him, wondering if this or that man was the one he sought. He did not have the slightest idea what he would do if he finally caught up with the man. He had been too afraid of his father to decline the offer, and now he was sure that he had finally come to the point where he had to do something about it. Feeling a little ill, Christopher slept badly that night. The next day, down on the river, he was very inattentive. He spilled once and took a cold dip while trying to swing a grandpa of all logs into position. He got his foot jammed another time and almost broke his leg. He had finally gotten so adept that he could travel along these logs like an otter, but this day seemed to have lost him all of his skill. Finally, above the noise of the water and the shouts of the other drivers, he heard a familiar bellow. Tiny had been standing on shore watching him, and Tiny was yelling for him to come over. Christopher went, obediently. Tiny greeted him with,
You asleep? Think we pay you to take swimming lessons? What the hell's the matter with you, Banjo?
Christopher looked up into Tiny's eye and said nothing. Tiny was the camp uncle because he could lick any man in it, because he was bigger than any man there, and because he always carried a heavy robber stick in his hand, big enough to spatter out a man's brains.
You've been acting like a tie peeler out there. I'll put you back to crummy, you scissorbill.
Christopher surprised himself. The term scissorbill, meaning properly a scab, and being in effect the worst thing one logger could say to another, did not set right on him for once. He hefted the wicked pike in his hand.
Who's a scissorbill?
Tiny rumbled down deep in his barrel chest. The roar came out like a buzzsaw going into a nail. No man in camp dared question Tiny. The robber stick swished through the air straight at Christopher's head. He ducked. The pike in Christopher's hand came up like a bayonet and almost impaled the giant boss. They parried for an instant. That robber stick sailed to the right. Christopher threw the pike away, doubled up his fists, and waded in. The crack of blows was louder than crashing trees. Tiny sledges landed like earthquakes on Christopher's jaw. Christopher went back, went down flat. Tiny leaped into the air like an adagio dancer. A worm's eye view of the descending caulks was a horrible thing to see. Tiny's feet were as big as doll buggies, and his legs, stretched interminably upward, looked as big as the timbers they carried. Christopher rolled sideways. Tiny's landing feet shook the camp so that the pans rattled in protest. Christopher came around, came up, and before Tiny had his balance, Christopher's fists landed with quick, snapping blows in Tiny's stomach. Wheezing, Tiny tried to land one of his own. Christopher's fists caved in Tiny's chest so hard that Tiny's backbone bulged. Torn turf flew under grinding boots. Bones snapped, knuckles cracked, blood flew like rain. Tiny reared and tried to throw Christopher down again. Christopher's boot went behind Tiny, and Tiny went down. Christopher took off, caulks heading for Tiny's face. Missing, Christopher felt his legs seized. He came down like a high faller. They rolled and twined. About them surged the camp. Even the polecats had heard the battle from afar and had come to see it. Somebody at last had challenged the camp bully. Somebody was logging Tiny off. But he couldn't win. Not Banjo. Banjo was too small to win, being only 6 feet to Tiny's 6 feet 6. Weight was all on Tiny's side, none on Banjo's, and yet the rosinbellies yelled out their lungs.
Come on, you Banjo.
Give it to him, Banjo.
Kill him! Kill him, Banjo!
Grunting, sweating, and straining against each other, the two gladiators came to their feet again. They faced each other in the man-bounded ring, glared, and then tore into each other. Cloth, broken caulks, fragment of Tiny's teeth, popping buttons, blue, explosive words all filled the atmosphere about them. Blow after blow landed, blows, heavy and hard and swift enough to kill an ordinary man, and yet they stood toe-to-toe and slugged. Blind, roaring mad, they screamed at each other and ripped at each other and took and gave like two bull jeans flying apart at top speed. Christopher went down. The ring hushed for an instant. Tiny reared up and sent a savage kick into Christopher's side. It sounded like breaking 2x4s, that kick. The ring groaned. But Christopher came up again, first on his knees, dodging, then all the way up to his feet. He rushed. His fists cracked hard against Tiny's jaw. Tiny's eyes turned back in his head. He tripped and staggered. Christopher, with a face like a blood-crazed tiger, followed straight through with countless, echoing, crushing blows. Tiny went down, limp. Christopher looked down at him and began to breathe hard. He would have picked the man up to hit him again, but the Rosenbellies held him back. They were patting him and shaking his hand and telling him,
"That's logging, Banjo. That's logging."
But he didn't hear them or even see them. He was staring up the bank. Old Man Plunkett was standing there, thumbs in lapels, rocking back and forth and looking down with a satisfied grin. A hard expression came into Christopher's battered face. He shook off the loggers and went up the bank and stopped squarely before his father and glared.
You own this camp.
Why, yes, that's right.
I thought so. Well, let me tell you this. You can get some hood to take care of this enemy of yours. To hell with him, and to hell with that. Get me?
Yes, that's...
Tiny was your kingpin here. That right?
Why, yes,
And I licked him,
said Christopher, looking very hard and snapping the tails from his words with his teeth.
So
And you need a superintendent here, and that's me. Am I right?
Certainly, Christy, but...
To hell with your butts. You can take your million to somebody else. I'm not killing anybody for the likes of you.
But you're already killed Johnny Newcombe and the man.
I've what?
That's right. The term Johnny Newcombe is what a logger calls a newcomer, a tenderfoot. You were Johnny Newcombe. I hear you're banjo-playing now. You're a rosin-belly, my boy. Johnny Newcombe is dead. I was getting too old to run my camps. I wanted to be sure I was turning them over into good hands, and...
But you mean I was sent here to commit suicide?
You were sent here to kill off that lily-livered kid you were. He's dead. My camps are worth $1 million. That's the pay. They're in your hands.
I get it. I'm boss here then.
And 49 other camps, son.
Banjo-Plunkett turned around and went down the bank. Tiny was staring dizzily up at his late adversary.
You had enough?
Yeah.
Then stand up.
Tiny stood up and was startled by the hand Banjo offered him, but he shook it warmly.
You're still superintendent here.
Well, thanks. I knew all along about Johnny Newcombe and...
Shut up. You can keep your job, but you better get busy on it. What the hell's the idea of letting all these Rosenbelly's sons stand around here gaping? Get 'em to work. Think we're running a vacation camp?
Tiny grinned. The bullpen boys grinned. Old Man Plunkett tucked his thumbs into his vest, rocked back and forth, and grinned.
Now you're logging,
said Old Man Plunkett, that being the highest praise one logger can hand to another.
Now you're logging, son.